this was an important topic for us to be talking about today, and also not just us talking and not giving concrete examples, but also inviting others who are doing some very interesting work around their own reporting to come and share with us this morning. So essentially, we're going to be together for the next hour and a half, give or take. And with me is Matt Ripley, the co-moderator for this session with Impact Frontiers. My name is Nasri Adam, and I'm the Director of Impact Communications and Regional Director for East Africa at AVPA. And we also have a number of speakers who will be coming in the course of the session, and you'll be hearing from them. And we have Evelyn Castle from Impact Ventures. She's the CEO and co-founder, as well as Noura Bakour, Head of ESG Impact at SPE Capital, Sarah Malaba, Chief Impact Officer at TICO, Gwendolyn Zord, Head of Impact at Acre Impact Capital, and last but not least, Henry Visage, who's the Manager, Signatory Engagement and Communications at Impact Principles. A very warm welcome to all of you. In terms of just some really quick housekeeping, please keep your mics on mute where possible. Please also use the chat for your questions, for your comments, for your contribution, anything that you want to share. And I can start to see different people coming in from different organizations already introducing themselves. A very warm welcome to everybody, and just to see that we have people joining from Kenya, Cape Town, South Africa. We have Morocco, Nigeria, the United Kingdom, attendees from Canada, Denmark, and the list continues. So please use the chat to introduce yourselves, and as I share any questions that you may have. We're going to be keeping an eye on that as we go along. So please do put in that. We have Sri Lanka and Italy also coming in, and Nepal. So quite an interesting range on the call already. And I just wanted to take an opportunity to introduce AVPA. We have a number of you who are coming into this session for the first time. And essentially, AVPA is a Pan-African network of social investors. We're an ecosystem. And as the name suggests, an alliance, we do have members. So some on this call are some of our members. And we are really focused on how we can deploy capital. Specifically, how can we deploy more catalytic capital to maximum social impact on the continent? And we're part of a global investment movement, and we have sister networks, Latin Impacto, Impact Europe, and AVPN. And we work quite closely towards this mission about how we can be able to improve the flow of capital into social investments, just across Africa, but across the world. And we are a Pan-African network. We have offices in Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Lagos. I'm based in Nairobi. Our CEO is based in Johannesburg, and we have an able team across these three regions working towards our shared goal and purpose. And how we do what we do is through these four areas. So knowledge sharing, which is what we're doing today, sharing through webinars and podcasts around impact standards, catalytic capital, impact stories, as well as research pieces, because data is such a driver, and it's really wanting, and it's a decision driver as well. We look at ourselves as playing a really good part in doing that, and with partners as well. So if there's any research that you're currently working on that you think would be of interest to this ecosystem, please do drop a line in the chat, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you on that. Capacity building, we offer our flagship fellowships, the Africa Impact Investing Fellowship, that's going to be opening in a couple of months. And we've been doing that for a couple of years, as well as the Africa Climate Investing Fellowship. And in this June, we'll be offering a catalytic capital training together with the UCT. And so we continue to build the capacity of the ecosystem, giving case studies that are really resonating with the environment in which we're existing with on the continent, and offering toolkits to support that learning. Another aspect that we do is also being a bridge, a connector between investors and investees, and linking those impact investments through the deal share platform that we run, as well as offering live deal share sessions. And this is done across our 3 hubs, as well as online. And last but not least, our ecosystem building. We sit in the middle and we work across the continuum of capital. We work with different stakeholders from a wide range of impact lenses or investment lenses or forms of capital or SDG focuses. And because of that richness and vibrance, we really are able to bring together a very vast community. And one of the big things we do is convene around topical issues such as today, and our convening element is a huge part of what we do. And I'd just like to hand over to Matt to also just talk very briefly about Impact Frontiers. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Nasri. And let me echo thanks to everyone for joining today's online masterclass. It's really great to see so much interest in this topic. So as Nasri said, my name is Matt Ripley. I'm a director here at Impact Frontiers. We're a non-profit learning and market building collaboration for investors who are trying to integrate impact into their investment decision making. One of the things that we do in our field building work is to build consensus in areas of impact measurement and management where standards and guidance don't yet exist. So the current focus of our work is really around how to improve the quality, credibility, consistency of investor reporting about their impacts. And that's the topic that I'm really excited to talk about today. And we're really delighted to have been partnering with AVPA and its community over the last 6 or more months on this initiative as part of a wider project funded by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. You'll hear more from me in a second, but I will hand back now to Nasri, who'll kick us off by setting the scene on the current state of impact reporting.
Thank you very much, Matt. So as we've said, lots of people are interested in this particular topic. And why is it interesting? And one of the things is around a greater need for transparency in understanding what and which impact investments are effective, who benefits from them, and the specific challenges that they address. In this reporting, it's become essential to develop clearer narratives and more comprehensive accounting of investments and their collective impact. While public and private entities may have different objectives, there must be a shared understanding of core stakeholders and outcomes. And this is our contribution, a collective contribution to this ecosystem in offering some similar language. And that's something that we've really understood is, as AVPA, we've seen different kinds of reports. We've seen different approaches to reporting, and being able to speak to the impact reporting norms and having that baseline methodology that can be easily adopted by any organization and any that is looking to improve on their impact reporting is something that we thought would be very important. So a couple of numbers, and these you easily Googleable. You can just go off and Google. So this is not me kind of offering you some, amazing figures, but they're important. The global impact investing market is projected to reach 1.5 trillion by 2020. This is this year. This has been a number that's been floating around. What does that mean? That there's a high growth around the impact investing, but 70% of impact investors in Africa have inconsistent or weak impact reporting. So there's a huge disconnect in some of the data that we're seeing there. And what are the implications of that? And that offers, of course, an opportunity, because it means that there is capital and it will flow if there's transparency, accountability, and better reporting. The numbers do matter. The case studies do matter. The information matters. And where there's information and data, there tends to be de-risked interest by those who hold the capital, and we're able then to do what AVPA stands for. Basically, we want to see more catalytic capital. We want the kind of capital that's growing and scaling the solutions that we need on the continent to address not just around the SDGs, but around all the different opportunities that exist. And I'm going to pause there and to also offer an invitation within the chat. Why do you think there's this current trend? And why do you think that this is important from where you're kind of sitting? And it will be interesting for you to put some of that in the chat as well. And as we do that, I think we have a poll, a very quick poll that we'd like to have you respond to. So what's the primary reason you produce an impact report? So start to put that in. We're just going to quickly have that up for a couple of seconds rather. And the options are required by our funders for marketing purposes, our own internal learning, share knowledge with peers and public. Not applicable, we don't. So so far, it's kind of coming in strong that there's an external force in our impact reporting reasons. So Eric, you can just close that off. And it looks from the data that comes up on our screen, and I'm sure everybody can see it, is that it's coming in very strongly that this is a requirement by our funders, with a close second of sharing the knowledge that we've found with our peers and public and our ecosystem. And then our own internal learning coming third, followed by marketing, and the lowest return on that poll was not applicable, we don't. The requirement element, yes, while being a driver, may not in itself be a bad thing, because it is enforcing good practice across the board. But let's interrogate that as we go along and learn a little bit more of why reporting is important. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Nasri. And thanks everyone for filling in that poll. That's so interesting to see. And of course, while it's the reality that in most instances, the primary reason that you may be producing an impact report is because you have to as a requirement, say, of funding, it's really interesting to see 30% of you saying, or almost 30% saying, the primary driver is really to share knowledge openly with the field. So I think that really speaks to a strong orientation towards learning as well as proving impact that we'll touch on in a second. Before we do that, what I'm going to turn to is the topic and double click on who these impact reports are actually for, and that almost 50% who say they have to do it as a requirement of funding. Because this masterclass is titled How to Write an Impact Report, but what we think is really important is that before starting to put pen to paper on that report, it's super important to start to think about the audience for that report. So the first step for anything about reporting is to really understand who the user of the report is and why they might want to engage with the report content. As you've all, or lots of you have correctly flagged, typically the primary users of an impact report are those providing money to the reporting organization. So as you can see in the diagram on the left, if we can stylize it, that the money and resources perhaps flow downwards from, in investment terminology, asset owners, through to those managing the money, the investment managers, through in turn to the companies, so the investees. Those capital providers, those providing the money at the so-called top of this chain, really want to be able to understand the real world impacts occurring at the so-called bottom of the chain, so they can make decisions about who to fund, for example, in a way that's actually informed by the well-being of people, communities, and the natural environment. So today we're going to focus on that box in purple. And the question being how impact funds can report their impact performance to the asset owners and asset allocators who are trusting them with money to invest. Oops. All right, gone through a few slides up. Okay. Now, for those not in the investment space, you can think of a similar chain, perhaps with donors at the top providing funding to an NGO, who in turn runs a series of projects and programs to reach affected communities. Now, we know that a lot of effort can go into impact reports and writing them. And one of the things we've heard at Impact Frontiers from those writing reports is that it's a bit of a black box. They've got little idea of how readers are actually engaging with the reports that they write. And to be honest, even if they're being read at all. And what we've heard from those writing reports, particularly impact funds writing reports, is sometimes there's a perception that asset owners receiving reports barely even look at them. Well, here's some good news. So Nasri shared some stats earlier. I'm going to share a few new stats of my own. We ran a survey with Impact Capital managers, and they're a membership network for impact investors. And we ran a survey with them to understand how asset owners are actually using impact reports. So as you can see on screen, there's a wide range of uses. The top one was actually to inform the reports that asset owners themselves produce. So think of a foundation, for example, who wants to produce its own impact report and needs data from underlying impact funds to do so. And for us, the really positive thing was that just 5% of respondents, you can see at the bottom there, say they don't use impact reports at all. So it isn't that these reports are going in a virtual drawer, but people, the asset owners, are actually using these reports to inform their own reporting and their own decision making. I'm just going to pause because I've got a couple of messages to say that my sound is not coming through correctly, or you can't hear me, but please do let me know if that's the case. Nasri, can I just do a quick sound check?
Yeah, I can, but maybe just amplify. I think this Frank is saying it's all good. A couple are going
Okay,
clear.
perfect. All right. So for those who might be having sound problems, potentially to turn up the volume from your side. Thank you for that group collective sound check. So, who are the users of reports? Here's some top tips to really keep the audience in mind when starting to write and starting to think about what content should be included in an impact report. First, of course, there's probably going to be multiple different readers of your report, each of whom are going to have a different type of use for it. Some asset owners, for example, maybe they want to be using the reports to form their own reporting, like we saw in the previous slide, while others might want to use the reports as a basis for deciding who to invest in and who to provide funds to. The thing to recognize is that you can never satisfy every single one of those diverse and different needs and uses. But what it really does is it helps to have an idea of a typical or average reader in mind when writing an impact report. And as we'll connect to and see later, this really helps to make decisions about what information to present in your report, how to present it, but also what to leave out in a way that doesn't lead to very long, very burdensome impact reporting. The second tip is really to remember that for report readers, less is sometimes more. And I'm sure you all know this intuitively from the reports that you yourselves read, but it may be tempting to put lots and lots of information into a really long and really dense report. But often what we say, it's about the quality, not the quantity of what you put in that report that counts. Just a small anecdote, we recently heard from a report writer, an impact fund of funds actually, who experimented with putting two different types of impact report on their website. And these were digital impact reports. So they were able to track how many pages people actually looked at and engaged with. One of the reports they put out was 40 pages long, and the other one was 10 pages long. And what they found was, on average, people read 6 pages out of the 10-page report, but only 5 pages out of the 40-page document. So in other words, the shorter report was actually more read than the longer one. So it ended up getting more information across than the big long report. So the third tip I'd have here is that think about the scope of report. So based on those kind of typical users and uses, should your report cover a single fund? Should it cover multiple impact funds if you have them? Or even, is it more sensible to cover the work of the entire organization? And fourth and finally, and this really came back from poll number 1, was don't forget that reporting isn't just about that top line of accountability and satisfying the requirements of your donors and funders, i.e. it's not just about proving your impact to others. It can really be a useful tool for your own learning needs as well. So the very act of having to sit down, put virtual pen to paper on an impact report can help bring about valuable opportunities to improve impact performance, as you can see from the Venn diagram on screen. So now I'd love to ask another question. So if we can launch the second audience poll, which I think is already on screen, I'd love to hear from you all. And again, we're forcing you to choose a single response here. But what I'd love to hear is, what do you think that asset owners perceive as being the biggest problem with the reports they receive? Is it the lack of comparability? So reports are, they all look different, they all have a different structure, and it's really hard to compare between them. Is it that the reports cherry pick aspects of impact performance reporting, i.e., for example, covering only success stories but leaving out challenges? Is it that asset owners don't feel they can actually trust the information in the reports, that they contain data of varying quality which hasn't been validated or verified, so they aren't reliable for decision making? Or is it that the information in the reports is partial? So it's missing key data or details, and so actually asset owners don't really get a full and complete picture of the impacts that are occurring. So we'll leave that poll open for a couple more seconds. Great to see loads of responses coming through, and we will end the poll in a second, and you'll all be able to see these very interesting figures. Here we go. So hopefully you can see this on screen. So coming out top, reliability. So questions around, can you actually trust the data that's being disclosed? But a good spread there across comparability challenges, the so-called cherry picking, and partial information in impact reports. Well, it's a bit of a trick question, I'm afraid, because obviously all of those are challenges that we've heard and challenges that asset owners in the community face. And actually, when we've done similar surveys with groups of institutional investors, with family offices, foundations, we often actually hear that comparability is rated as the top pain point and the top challenge, particularly when those funders, those asset owners, are trying to use impact performance reports to decide essentially who to invest in, i.e. to inform their investment decisions. But you're totally right. What we hear is that in the main, well, it's not that people are not trying hard to produce really good impact reports, but the reports that are being produced are not perhaps as comparable, not perhaps as credible or as complete as they could be, which actually limits their usefulness. At the same time, you can think about the investment managers and the impact funds preparing reports. All these same factors actually make it quite challenging to write a report because it can be unclear, like what does a good report look like? And so the whole reporting process becomes more burdensome than it actually should be. So this is where the impact performance reporting norms comes in that Nasri mentioned earlier, and that I'll spend a couple of minutes now just walking you through. So this is an initiative that we at Impact Frontiers started with industry networks and associations a couple of years ago. And the idea of the impact performance reporting norms, or reporting norms for short, is to provide consensus about the content, structure, and format of impact reports. As I said, the point of all this is to make reporting less burdensome for those writing the reports, but more useful for those reading the reports. And we're doing this at Impact Frontiers as a non-profit working for the public good. So the idea is to have these reporting norms out there, and I'll share the link to them later in the webinar, and it'll also be in the follow-up emails, that they are open access, non-proprietary criteria that people can use when preparing their impact reports, but also to assess, evaluate, or verify impact performance reports. And over time, we hope this can become a market-tested prototype that can inform future disclosure standards by, say, standard setters or even within national regulations. So here's a quick overview of the timeline. I won't go into great detail on this, about where we started from a couple of years ago with a review of the landscape of the reporting standards that were out there, and version 1 of the impact performance reporting norms were released in April last year. We're now collecting feedback very actively through a 2-year pilot phase where investors are piloting and using the reporting norms to help inform and draft their reports. And again, later on, as well as the link to the reporting norms themselves, I'll share an email address that you can write to get involved in a free pilot program we're running with over 150 investors around the world to help them prepare their impact reports. But what I want to do now is to talk about the content of the reporting norms themselves. So of course, as we go through both this material now, but also for the remainder of the webinar, please do write any questions that you may have in the chat box. I can't promise that we're going to get to them all, and I see some really interesting questions already, but we'll try and address as many as we can as we go along. If not, we promise we will answer every single one in the follow-up email afterwards and share the responses with you all. So, the content of the reporting norms themselves. We see the content, think of it as the basic recipe that impact investors should follow when they sit down to write an impact report. And the reporting norms suggest 6 sections, and there's a bit more detail on the types of content in each section that are suggested. The first is entity overview and impact thesis. So this is who you are and what you're trying to do, quite simply. The second is impact management process. So this is all about how you're trying to do it. In other words, the impact measurement and management processes and practices that you have in place. The third is impact performance. So this is really the meat of the reporting norms. This is what actually happened in the reporting period that typically the reporting norms assumes is a yearly reporting cycle, but of course that can be longer or shorter depending on the organization. The fourth section that we're not going to touch on in detail today is governance of impact, not governance of the organization, but governance of impact management. And the fifth that we will touch on, and including here a real life example of, is including case studies that can help bring impact performance to life. The sixth part that we won't touch on today is independent review. So this is optional in the reporting norms and essentially is there to provide a space or a summary of how data in the report was assured or verified to align with the reporting norms. So this is the suggested structure for the report. But a lot of the very granular specifics of kind of what falls into each of these sections are left to the individuals and the organizations actually writing the reports. And that brings us to the next slide. So if we're leaving quite a lot of flexibility in these reporting norms to those writing reports, well, how do they know what to do? Well, this is where the reporting norms are underpinned by what's called the characteristics of useful information. And think of these as a set of guardrails and guides to help those writing impact reports. And they really take over where the standardization of the content and the structure of impact reports finishes. So they're basically the way to decide what information to present for each of these sections. I'm very briefly going to walk you through them here, but particularly focus on these first two that are known as the fundamental characteristics. So they suggest that the information that you put into an impact report should be relevant to decision-making needs, and the information should be faithfully presented. And that's a long way of saying the information should be as complete as possible, neutrally presented, and accurate. These are the most important characteristics of a high-quality impact report. The usefulness of information can be enhanced further by these sort of darker blue enhancing characteristics, the four you can see below. And that's if the information is comparable, verifiable, timely, and understandable. As I said, we're not going to go into this in huge detail now, but we'll keep coming back to them throughout the rest of the masterclass to explain what they mean in practical terms. But they are important principles to keep in mind as you start to write an impact report and decide what information to put in, but as I said earlier, what information to leave out. So here's a couple more top tips. First, the reporting norms, and I think this was a question earlier, can, if I scroll back up, do you have to do everything in the reporting norms given different audiences? Can parts of the proposed impact reporting norms be excluded or adapted? The answer is yes, but it's done on a what's known as a comply or explain basis. So if you're choosing not to include the suggested content in the reporting norms, that's absolutely fine. Just put a note, it could be a footnote, it could be an annex, explaining why that particular content isn't relevant. And what we found is that really helps report readers understand the decision making behind what you've put into the report and what you left out. And perhaps because it's not relevant, as you say in that question, to the audience or context. But that comply or explain is really at the basis of the reporting norms. Second tip, genuine impact reports, combination of qualitative and quantitative information is recommended, with neither being preferable to the other. What we've heard is what tends to work really well in reports are metrics, but metrics that are held together by a compelling narrative. So think about the numbers, but the story that helps readers make sense of those numbers. And third, and we'll get into this in a second too, the reporting norms suggest that impact funds report on each investee or asset individually. Optionally, those who want to do so can also try and synthesize, aggregate, roll up those individual investee data into the portfolio level to tell a picture of impact performance at the portfolio level, but that's entirely an optional extra. And before we go to the next poll, where we'd love to hear from you all, what I wanted to flag was that when we started out working with AVPA last year and started to engage this community, and also to do things like running an in-person masterclass in November at last year's AVPA conference, what we really heard is, this content is great, but if we're just getting started with impact reporting, and if perhaps we don't have a big team in place, and we don't have lots of resources and time to dedicate to impact reporting, but we want to do a good job of it, and we want to start out on the right path, how can you as Impact Frontiers and you as a community make it easier for us to get going with high quality, lower burden impact reporting? So we actually have developed, and we'll share a link again later in this webinar and in the follow-up email you'll get later in the week, for an impact reporting template designed to do exactly that. And that reporting template comes with a reference guide of how to complete key sections along with illustrative examples. Both the template and the guide are in beta format. So we'd really welcome your feedback on them. And again, later in the webinar, I'll be taking you through some specific examples of each of these sections from the template, but it is there. It's ready for those of you who want to use it to start helping this or using it to inform your impact reporting. So time for another question. That's enough of me talking. We'd love to hear from you. And this is another one where we're forcing you to make a single choice. What part or what aspect of an impact report is the hardest for you to prepare? Is it the impact thesis, so kind of articulating and putting in your theory of change? Or is it the impact management approach, explaining how you think about impact throughout the investment cycle and the framework, standards, or tools used? Is it the impact performance of each investee, so it's measuring and actually reporting on data from each and every single one of your investees or assets? Or is it that optional thing I was saying before, how to synthesize and aggregate that data at the fund, the portfolio level? Or is it actually not just thinking about the positive impacts or the good stuff that's happening, but the more challenging aspects as well, perhaps where impact is underperforming or negative outcomes may have appeared? Or finally, is it the case study part? Is it about crafting compelling evidence-based narratives and challenges around that? So I'll give everyone a moment to put their responses for those who wish. I already see over 150 coming in, which is great. And then we will share the results with you all. Super. So I think we can probably end the poll and share the results so you can see them on screen. Okay, wonderful. So very interesting, and probably not a surprise that negative or unintended impacts are ones we've definitely heard are a challenging area to integrate into impact performance reporting. And a fairly even balance there across portfolio level, impact reporting challenges, but also on getting the data and reporting at the level of each and every investee, but with a few also finding these other areas around disclosing the impact thesis and impact management approach a challenge as well. So on to that relevant section of an impact performance report. So what I'll now do is provide a very short framing for how impact performance reports can start to think about these two topics on screen. So I've circled the two relevant parts of the reporting norms. So these are designed to help readers understand what you're trying to achieve and how you're setting out to achieve it. In other words, they provide really important context to all the results that are disclosed in sections 3 and beyond. So this is the suggested content in the reporting norms. Very briefly to run through it, it starts off by suggesting simply an overview of the reporting entity and the time period covered, moving on to talk about the impact thesis, and that can take a number of different forms. So for instance, a visual or written theory of change, a logic model, or similar. And then we get into section 2, which is about how impact influences decision-making throughout the investment process, how stakeholders, affected and interested stakeholders have been identified, but also around data practices. And so here's how these sections appear in the template that I was mentioning to you earlier. And just to provide some explanation, the text in blue is designed to be updated and customized. So again, it's totally up to you to use this template or your own format. And if you're using your own format, there's the reporting norms and the guidance in that to help you do it. But the idea of this template is to provide an option for you to make it, as easy and as simple as possible to get started. And what I'd say here is that, and you can see this on screen at the very embedded in the text, and you'll be able to see it if you look at the full reporting template, is that both the impact thesis and impact management approach are really important to include in impact reports. However, they may not be the only place where an impact fund is describing its approach. So one of the founding ethoses of the reporting norms is to try and reduce the reporting burden by saying, well, if you're already disclosing this information to your asset owner or publicly elsewhere, just put a link to that disclosure. You don't need to repeat all the same content. So the impact principles are one of the most widely used frameworks for investors to disclose their impact management practices. So just as an example, those who are already signatories to the operating principles for impact management, those known as the impact principles, can actually complete this impact report and align with the reporting norms simply by just putting a link to their disclosure statements. So in other words, it really tries to reduce the reporting burden and the length of reports by just signposting to where people can find relevant contextual information elsewhere without having lots of duplicative content in the report itself. So seeing as I've mentioned the operating principles for impact management, I would now like to welcome Henry from the Impact Principles Secretariat to tell us a little bit more about them. And Henry, especially if you can speak to some of those sections or highlight some of those sections that are relevant to what I was just mentioning around the impact thesis and the overall impact management approach.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Nasri. And thank you all for being here. Amazing to see such excitement about impact reporting. So my name is Henry Westwood. I'm the manager of signatory engagement and communications for the impact principles. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the impact principles are a global standard for integrating impact throughout the investment lifecycle. What that really means is that the impact principles are a standard for impact management practice. And they really refer to all the kind of groundwork that you would do to design your impact system and set you up to ultimately be able to produce a strong impact report for your LPs. So brief history, the impact principles were started in 2019 by IFC. And we are now hosted by the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN. And the reason the impact principles were started was really to provide clarity and provide a kind of shared understanding and definition of what it means to invest for impact. So what are the actual concrete steps that investors need to take to ensure that they are kind of have a rigorous approach to impact management? Our belief is that through the broad adoption of these principles, we can ultimately drive more capital, including more catalytic capital, into impact investing by increasing the rigor, transparency, and credibility of impact management, both for the individual investors who become signatories, as well as for the impact investing market as a whole. So if we could go to the next slide. So, excuse me, these are the 9 impact principles. So they're an end-to-end framework for impact management practice. So they really cover the entire investment lifecycle, from the early stages of strategic intent all the way through to impact at exit, which is principle 7. As Matt was pointing to, principles 1 and 2, I think are particularly relevant. This is where you speak to defining your strategic impact objectives, as well as the way that you're managing for impact on a portfolio basis. So instead of having a kind of one-off or specific approach on an investment level, you really want a consistent kind of impact system that applies across your portfolio or across kind of whatever level of assets you are managing for impact. And the impact principles do not prescribe very specific kind of tools or frameworks, but rather they're both broad enough to be widely applicable across asset classes and investor types and regions, while still being specific enough to be kind of actionable and fit for purpose for many impact investors. Principle 9, disclosure and verification, is really the kind of defining feature, I think, and what sets the impact principles apart. It's also part of what defines us as a standard, as opposed to simply being a framework. So the framework of the impact principles, these 9 principles, are a common good for the market. They're a market infrastructure that anyone can use when designing their impact system. But the principle 9 comes in and it effectively ensures that investors who become signatories to the impact principles publicly commit to aligning with these principles. They publish this annual disclosure statement to which Matt was referring on an annual basis. And they have that alignment independently verified on a regular basis by an independent third party. So I really think that all of these principles touch on impact performance reporting on some level. My line in these conversations is that it's very hard to have a strong impact report if you don't have strong impact management practices to back it up and to ultimately produce those kind of figures that you're reporting to your LP. But for the sake of this conversation, I think principles 1 and 2 are particularly important. I'll do a quick, if we go to the next slide, just a very quick overview of our signatory base. So the majority of impact principle signatories are asset managers investing in private markets. Although we do have a strong contingent of asset owner signatories, including the majority of global development finance institutions and multilateral development banks. We also hear that asset owners and allocators use the impact principles when conducting due diligence or assessing potential investees for investment. And as of now, the majority of our signatories are in Europe and North America, but we do have small and growing and very committed communities in emerging markets, and particularly in Africa. And that's very much a strategic focus of ours, is to ensure that as the impact markets continue to grow and mainstream in these regions, that we are supporting kind of local and regional asset managers in their impact journeys. So with that, I will hand it back to Matt. Correct?
Thank you so much, Henry. Great.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to turn to an intervention by Gwendolyn from Acre Impact Capital. And Acre is both a signatory to the impact principles and actively using and piloting the impact performance reporting norms. So Gwendolyn, I'd love to hear from you if you can tell us just a little bit more about your impact strategy and impact management approach, and how that appears and informs your approach to reporting and disclosure more broadly.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Matt. So I guess I will answer the question organically and going through the presentation that I've prepared. I will try to be as succinct as possible. So there, you'll see the slides are quite detailed in terms of the information that I would recommend. And I focused only on the first two, which are the company overview, the entity description, and then the how impact influences your decision making, your impact management process. And those are very much aligned with OPIM's principles 1 and 2, which is about your strategic impact objectives and how that is aligned with your investment strategy, and then how you manage impacts on a portfolio basis. So these first two principles really speak to each other, and there's a lot of integration. So what I'll do is, and this is an important caveat, disclaimer, we have not produced an impact report to the impact reporting norm standard. However, I am participating in the working group of the reporting norms and have been for some months. And our intention is certainly to report to the standard. So Acre is a new fund. We only first closed our fund in April last year. So we plan to produce our first impact report this year. We've done 2 investments so far, so we're very nascent. But essentially, we are a debt fund. We lend money to sovereigns. And we do quite a niche form of finance in that we provide the 15% down payment or commercial tranche of ECA-backed transactions. So ECAs are export credit agencies. ECAs can provide guarantees for up to 85% of an infrastructure project's value, but that leaves a chronically unfunded 15% commercial piece, which requires direct sovereign risk exposure. So we are dedicated to funding that piece. So it is a little bit different in that our borrowers are governments, so it's a lot harder to sort of entrench these than it is if you're a private equity fund and you're working with a private company. And then also we're not an equity shareholder, we're a debt provider. So we are faced with sort of extra challenges in terms of conveying this across, but we really see it as an important aspect of being a market shaper in this asset class. We think it's really important to set a high precedent, both for investment performance and impact performance. So this slide is basically just saying, if you're going to introduce your entity, you just sort of high level, this is what we do, this is how we're structured, what we are. So I think that's pretty obvious for everyone. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so now it gets to sort of more of the integration. So how are you integrating your investment thesis and your impact thesis? So my approach to impact is very much that I think a lot of people think they hear you're an impact fund, they think that means concessionality. But as we know from the GIN's definition, you can be both motivated by financial performance and motivated by impact performance. And really the beauty of impact investing is that you get to do both. So I think it's important, this particular challenge of OPIM 1, which is how do your impact objectives align with your investment strategy? How are the two interlinked? And that's very much speaking to the first principle of the impact reporting norms, which is how are you addressing the challenge? So you can see here we've integrated. So the challenge that we're addressing is a financing gap, right? For the 15% down payment that's needed. So we're providing that solution. So the way that we then do that is we look at what particular geographies, and because we're taking African risk exposure, we have to be quite intentional in assessing that risk. So we don't exclusively rely on Moody's, Fitch, S&P. We do our own assessments. And in some cases, we'll even provide financing where there is no credit rating. So it's quite important that we have that geographical diversification piece. And then aligning to that is where then do we invest? And so our impact sectors are very much our investment themes, right? So we invest across 4 themes, which are renewable power, health, food and water scarcity, sustainable cities, and green transport. So here you can see how, leading on from the previous slide where we saw these are our target sectors, you now see how that investment strategy is merged with our impact strategy. So our primary objective is we build infrastructure. So we're an infrastructure fund. And these are the types of investments we would do under each theme. And these are the links to the specific SDGs with the primary intention of contributing to economic growth in the countries in which we invest and reducing inequalities. So it's very important that the infrastructure we build serves underserved populations and is essential infrastructure. So for example, we recently turned down an investment to do a revamping of an airport. And we just said, that's not essential infrastructure, that doesn't have a clear emissions reduction case, etc. So we very much choose our investments and then align how we invest with the SDGs. And then, of course, at the bottom, we apply 2 very intentional lenses, which is a climate lens, which is essentially that we're Paris aligned, and then a gender lens, which is essentially that we are 2X aligned. Okay. This is our public theory of change. So it is available in our OPIM disclosure statement on our website. You're welcome to go and peruse that if that's helpful for you. So we do have a much more granular theory of change, which we use internally. That basically what we do is we define the theory of change, and then for each input, activity, output, outcome, we link to a measurement framework to be able to produce our impact results. But I'm not going to get into impact performance because I do think the data collection is the meat of it, right? And we were talking even, this is really where I think the biggest challenge is, and around the negative impacts was also picked up as a challenge in the poll. And I think the challenge to that is actually a data challenge, because when you do your proper data collection, that's when you're going to see your negative impacts. So I think it's really important that although you have a measurement framework linked to a theory of change, that needs to be dynamic, so that if you pick something up that gets baked in now to your measurement plan and can affect your discounting of your results, so in your contribution. I don't want to overwhelm people with contribution, but this is a masterclass, so I will speak quite technically, and hopefully if there's anything you don't understand, this is all available in open in the Impact Frontiers approach. Okay, so that's our investment level impacts and system level impacts, because as I said, obviously our investments are creating change, but also we do have a particular market shaping role. So we do want to acknowledge and report on that as well. Okay, so this is speaking to the section which Matt had flashed up around what do you do at origination screening, what do you do at the investment or the holding period, and what do you do at exit. So obviously there's a gap here in terms of we haven't defined, for us it is an exit, it's loan realization, right? But that is important. So that's definitely a piece that we need to add to be aligned to the reporting standards. So essentially this slide is just defining, this is what we do at each stage. These are the specific activities that we do in terms of impact, and these are the outputs. So obviously in our monitoring process, the key output there is the impact reporting. Okay. Next slide, thank you. Oh, did we skip one? No. Yes, that one, thank you. Okay, so this, I think, to me, and I've been using the Impact Frontiers 5 dimensions of impact approach for 5 years, nearly, I think. And it's to me, it is the most accessible, the one that makes the most sense. And I think one of the biggest contributors to unification and enabling that comparability, if you really follow this approach, coupled with using globally accepted standards like IRIS+. Okay, so you've got these are just samples, because your 5 dimensions of impact are who, what, how much, contribution, and risk. So these are just speaking to who and how much as a sample. So these are sort of guiding questions. And again, Impact Frontiers website is really super and will guide you on all of this. And if you go to Jen and you put in your project, it's going to give you your process exactly aligned to the 5 dimensions of impact. So it's really nice how we're getting this convergence in the industry. And I've been in this space for over 10 years, I think more like 12 years. And it's really been amazing for me to see how far we've come as an industry and how much sort of consensus and alignment there is. And I remember back in the day, the poll question was always, what's the biggest challenge? And it was like, we don't have unified frameworks. Well, guys, problem has been addressed. We do now, because these very much speak to each other. So this is my opinion, of course. Okay, so this is an output from using the GIN system, which will give you, okay. And then just a note on contribution, because I do think that is the most technical of the 5 dimensions, and bearing in mind that your investee is going to have a contribution and you as a fund are going to have a contribution. So just remember to always think of that in the two aspects, right? I do think if you want more information, of course, you're welcome to reach out to me on email, but obviously also the IF team and the OPIM team. But that is, to me, the most technical aspect. And then I just wanted to come back to this slide, and it was so great to see it actually iterated across the presentation, because I always think go back to first principles when you're writing an impact report. Think, of course, about these principles. Is it verifiable, timely, comparable, understandable? And I love that anecdote about how the shorter report was more engaged with. It's a challenge for me. I tend to be very long-winded. So that's definitely a working area for myself. But yeah, so what I've tried to do here is just to show, these are perhaps how we would present once we come to do our first impact report. But then as we don't have that information, I'm always saying these are sort of the resources that you can use to help address that question. And of course, just bearing in mind, the alignment between IF and OPA. Thank you.
Gwendolyn, thank you. Thank you so much indeed for sharing those rich insights. And I see lots of questions coming in still on the chat, so please feel free to keep those coming. We'll try and speak to those that we can, but also to answer in line to all of them. So I will now take us through the next sections that we're going to focus on, which is really about, as I said, the meat of the reporting norms, presenting the results of the reporting period for each and every investment, as well as providing some narrative in the case studies for a sample of investment. And so I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, but just to put up on screen, this is the suggested content under section 3 of the impact performance reporting norms. So just to highlight a few, it's really encouraging people to report as far down the impact pathway as possible towards outcomes and impacts, but recognizing that in many cases that's going to be difficult to get to because of data constraints, because of cost considerations, or just because outcomes may take a little bit of time to be realized. We call out with positive and negative, intended and unintended results, but also the importance of contextualizing impact data relative to targets and explaining why those targets were set and the rationale for any changes in targets. Results and performance relative to thresholds for what might constitute a positive outcome versus a negative outcome, for instance, and why that threshold is appropriate in the given context. And finally, and we'll get into some more real life experience of this in a second, just explanations. We know that in the impact space, we deal with imperfect information, imprecise data, so defining the terms and metrics being used, providing succinct methodological notes on sources, assumptions, calculations is really important. Going back to thinking around my first point around who is the audience and how can they really understand the logic behind what you're choosing to disclose or not. So you might have looked at the last slide and thought, oh my goodness, if I have to do that for each and every single one of my investees, I'm going to have a super long report. So of course, that's not the intention for the reporting norms. And as I said earlier, the point is the opposite, actually to reduce the reporting burden while increasing decision usefulness. So going back again, just to put up on screen those characteristics of useful information, because that is the, as Gwendolyn said, the first principles of how to decide what to put in and what to put out. And I'm just going to give an example here, a scenario on our website. We have more scenarios that help try and take these quite conceptual and a bit academic characteristics into real world decisions that you might be facing when writing an impact report. For instance, you might be doing, I don't know, a climate tech investment where the underlying data from the portfolio company is actually super complex and challenging and data driven to interpret. So you're wondering, like, should I dumb this down in the impact report? Like, how should I present it? Like, should I put all the complex information in there because it's highly technical? Well, using these characteristics, it suggests that highly technical content should still be included because while understandability of reports is really important in the enhancing characteristics, ultimately relevance to decision making is the most important part of the impacts performance you're reporting. So actually you should include complicated information if you think it's relevant for a reader to understand the impact being experienced by people and or the planet. And just to give you a little sneak preview there of the impact template that again you'll get the link to after this webinar, we provide a couple of options here, a tabular format and a narrative format for completing section 3. And to briefly touch on case studies, we'll get to this again in an example in a second. Case studies can be really useful, really valuable to include, and readers appreciate them. But one thing we heard during the development of the reporting norms was that readers are often left, to be honest, a little bit confused as to why that case study was included. Because you're typically choosing 1 or 2 or a small number of cases to put in, readers were left wondering, well, why have you chosen to include a case study on company A over company B, for example? How did you go about making that decision, and what are you trying to show by including that case study? So the reporting norms provides more guidance on justifying and disclosing the rationale for choosing and presenting some case studies over others. again, I'm not going to go into super detail on these top tips now, because I would really like to get practical again and hear from those who are doing the reporting and going through a reporting journey. So I'd first like to turn to Evelyn, and thank you so much for joining us today, Evelyn, to share the EHA Impact Ventures perspective. So basically got two questions for you, if you're able to speak to both of them briefly. And the first is, as a venture capital fund reporting at both the investee and the portfolio level, how are you going about making decisions about choosing what information to present and how to present it? And as I mentioned there, the reporting norms really try to emphasize the importance of providing some explanations and impact performance in terms of definitions, data sources, calculations. So how do you tackle that in your impact reports?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I'm definitely taking notes. So I appreciate everything that you've already talked about on the call. So we can go to the first slide. Just a little bit about me. I've been in the health field for all of my career. Actually, I'm a founder and entrepreneur myself, but then also over the last 5 years or so have been focusing most of my time on being an impact investor. And we can go to the next slide. We're using my company EHA Impact Ventures as kind of a case study on how we are doing our impact reporting. So just a little bit about us. We are a nonprofit impact investor, and I actually thought it was really interesting, the question that you said in the beginning about like how we use our impact reports. So for us, as I go through, how we've done our metrics and all of that, we mostly use our impact reports for fundraising. So it was really important for us that we're looking at metrics that are like clear and fairly easy to understand. And then also, things that are kind of like able to build emotion and get people excited about like working with us. So that's kind of the lens that we do a lot of our reporting on. Obviously, we hope that at some point we're looking more internally and using those metrics for like better decision making on making investments. But we're still fairly young. We haven't had any exits yet. So that's what we're looking at from the reporting kind of goals. So we can go to the next slide. So this kind of like, so I was asked obviously like, how do we choose what information do we present? So the most important, aspects are for us that like it aligns with our impact thesis. We invest only in female-founded health and nutrition companies. So we're really focused on, gender equality, job creation, and health outcomes. So based on that, we want to make sure that our metrics are tied to that. The other thing that's really important is like we do have to look at like what metrics are important to our stakeholders, and that's either for us, our donors or our co-investors, and they sometimes have more specific areas that they're targeting. So that also guides what metrics we choose. I did highlight, and I'll say it again probably a couple of times in my presentation, that it's really important that we choose as few metrics as possible to tell our impact story, because as a founder and a business owner, you really don't want to put this huge burden on the entrepreneurs in putting together 100 metrics. You really want them to focus on getting good data for as few as possible that you need to tell your story. And then looking at that kind of like balance between the portfolio level and the investee level. So from the portfolio level, and for us, it's not really necessarily just portfolio, it's like our whole company, but I'm guessing, obviously there are much larger companies out there that would look at it at a portfolio level. But what are kind of like the higher level, like unifying metrics that all of your portfolio companies can report on that can give you kind of like this aggregate collective impact? And then in addition to that, you would have like the investee level metrics that are more tailored to that investee to highlight like their specific contribution. So that's kind of like the high level of like what we're trying to do. And then on the next slide, the next few slides, I'll show you how we do that at EHA Impact Ventures. So this is actually a pullout from our 2024 impact reports. the first two numbers are obviously just kind of numbers that we have that we report on, and that we know that our readers are interested in. And then the other numbers that, you know, we look at from the portfolio level are total new jobs created. So that's something that each company reports on that we want to pull together. Again, I said that we're, you know, really female focused. So we really care about the percentage of women in our managerial roles in the portfolio and the number of women just employed in our portfolio companies. So we pull out these numbers at an aggregate level to kind of show high level the impact that all of our companies are having. And then on the next slide, we actually look, because we only have, well, we have 6 portfolio companies now. So it's easy enough for us to report kind of on all of our portfolio companies. So this is what the report looks like this year. And so you can see the kind of like the top 4 indicators there, or metrics there, are those portfolio level metrics. And for this company, they're fairly well established, and like they were able to report on all of the 4 portfolio level metrics that we were interested in. And then, you know, our goal internally is that we should only have like 3 to 5 investee level metrics per company, because we feel like that's a realistic number that our companies can report on. And again, it makes it so that it's we're getting our impact across to like our investors and our donors without kind of like overburdening them with too much. So actually somebody mentioned this in the comment, or in the in the comment box, but I thought it was kind of interesting of like one of the indicators that we worked with for this company was the number of smallholder farmers that they engaged. And that's because so much donor funding comes in around this kind of like smallholder farmer side of things. So we wanted that to be one of the metrics that we look at with them. And there's some sub metrics that we work on with them so that they can then use that for additional financing outside of just us. Client savings premium, you know, this was something that our co-investor is really focused on around affordability and accessibility. And then obviously like volume purchased from female suppliers is something that we really care about. So that's kind of just to highlight like why we came up with like those 3, and to look at like the different reasons of like how, or the different areas that you would want to look at when choosing the metrics at the investee level company. And then we can go to the next slide. So this is just the second company that I wanted to use as an example. And I think the things to highlight here is on the first indicator, new jobs created. So technically, if you just look at that indicator, it should just say 7. But there's like a little bit more to that. You know, they have these kind of like contract and part-time staff, and then they have all of these contract therapists that they work with. And this was really important to them. It was really important to us because, again, job employment is a very big aspect of what we do. So, you know, so we added that in there to add that kind of like context and to add a little bit more like oomph to the reports. And then the other thing here that you'll notice is missing is the kind of like 4th portfolio level indicator, which was gender equity. And they're a very small company, so it was really hard for us to like sit there and like actually calculate like the gender wage equity for them. And so like, yes, we could have finagled the numbers to like come up with something that we thought was reasonable. But when we looked at it, you know, we were saying like, we would rather just not report on it than kind of report on it and then have to like, explain the numbers of like how we did the math. And, you know, yes, you know, I agree that you could do that. But for that specific case, we just didn't feel like it wasn't adding anything to the impact, and we didn't feel like it was super valuable. So we just figured instead of forcing it, we'll just go ahead and not report on that metric for this company. And then, so moving on to just kind of like how to present your metrics in general. So our suggestion is around consistency. You know, it's been nice for some of our older portfolio companies that we can kind of see the change in indicators over time to show growth. As I mentioned, you know, that kind of like emotional aspect is really important to us and our funders. So we do actually pay for some of these like communication materials to come out around, you know, using videos and whatever to show the impact. And then the third thing is around testimonials. We found that including these in our impact reports just enhances credibility, and again, gives a little bit more of that kind of like emotional backbone for our readers to understand the impact that the companies are having on like everyday people. And this is kind of what I wanted to talk about when it came to like adding in that context box. So this is something that we did heavily in our 2023 annual reports, just to kind of like explain how we were coming up with the metrics and how we were defining them, but then also adding in some clarity around like if the numbers didn't really seem to make sense. So in this example, this is our gender wage equity for one of our portfolio companies in 2022. It was crazy. It was 3.4. And then in 2023, it went down to 1.1. So, you know, we wanted to kind of explain why we felt like the numbers did that, and that technically it looks like a decrease, but in reality, there were extenuating circumstances, and, you know, we're still at gender wage equity. So, you know, I just would suggest, you know, adding in context boxes where needed rather than not reporting numbers. Again, if it helps to tell your story, or if it's such a clear portfolio level metric that you can't really like not report on that. Next slide. So then, yeah, I think that's the end. Basically, my key takeaways is just keep it simple, use as minimal necessary metrics, focus on kind of like honest data. And then if you can, leverage existing data from your investee companies, because again, it just makes their lives a little bit easier. Happy to connect with you all outside of this. There's my email. Please reach out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Some super practical tips there, and I think a really powerful example. I'd like to turn now to the other aspect of reporting on impact performance, which is not necessarily just at the investment or portfolio level, but actually using case studies, which we've heard can be a really powerful tool. So I'd like to welcome Nora to share her perspective from SPE Capital and their impact report. And Nora, we've got we're running at the kind of the tail end of the webinar here, so if you can take kind of 5 minutes or so, we'd love for you to be able to walk us through and share your perspective on, you know, the case studies you include in a report. Just why did you choose those? How did you go about choosing those case studies for particular investments over others?
Thanks, Matt. And hello, everyone. Yeah, so case study. I really like case studies thrown into impact reports. I think they serve as very powerful tools for showcasing the tangible impact outcomes of investments. For our impact report, and as you can see here on the screen, we selected a case study on one of our portfolio companies named Amanis Pharma, which is a leading manufacturer of essential pharmaceuticals, mainly antibiotics in Morocco, and a hospital provider for critical drug treatment. Now, before I unpack sort of the rationale behind selecting this particular case study, I just want to stress that it's very important to be intentional about using a case study. The choice of the case study really needs to be deliberate, and how we go about constructing a meaningful case study should be a strategic process. So when developing a case study, I think there are 3 critical questions that we really should ask ourselves. 1, what type of case study best conveys our message? 2, how do we select the right case? And 3, how do we collect and analyze the relevant data to make the case study meaningful? Now, for our impact report, we selected what we call an illustrative case study to showcase Amanis's transformative role in improving healthcare access in Morocco and sub-Saharan Africa. This type of case study is particularly useful for providing concrete examples of achieved impact, making it well suited for portfolio companies that do have sort of these concrete, verifiable results. But other types of case studies, such as exploratory, critical instance, or cumulative case studies, these are other types that you'll see. They serve different analytical purposes. But given the substantial progress that was made by MNEs in expanding access to essential medicine, driving job creation, and implementing sustainable initiatives, an illustrative case study for us was the most appropriate choice. Now, in terms of how we selected MNEs Pharma for a case study, there are various selection criteria that one can choose from. The selection could be based on just pure convenience, choosing a company with readily available data, or it could be based on probability, really just selecting company kind of at random from the portfolio. For a case study selection, we took on a purpose-driven approach, meaning that we chose MNEs to highlight a high impact investment that successfully contributed to the healthcare industry and boosting the local economy. Now, within this purpose-driven category, there are different ways to go about it. For this case study, we emphasized best case scenario, meaning we illustrated how MNEs expands healthcare access, enhances industrial capabilities, improves governance. And we selected a case that highlights a significant industry challenge, and that is dependence on pharmaceutical imports, and showcases MNEs' role in substituting life-saving drugs locally. So this checks what we would call the special interest selection sub-criteria. Now, there are different other alternative selection approaches within this category, within this purpose-driven category, includes worst-case scenarios where you examine unsuccessful investments for lessons learned. So that's one way to go about it. Or cluster analyses where you're comparing investments across sectors, geographies, or themes. But for us, I mean, the sub-criteria for a best case scenario and for a special interest was kind of the best option. So really just kind of going through the various ways, various approaches for selecting a case study. Now, while MNEs was the best fit for this study, we did face certain challenges and limitations. For instance, long-term sustainability metrics, such as job creation projections, do require further validation. We also only focused on a single company rather than on a comparative analysis. So, you know, this does kind of provide a narrower lens than what could have been done. So there are always, you know, certain limitations you kind of have to work with. In terms of the data that we gathered and we analyzed, you know, it's really important when constructing a meaningful case study to use robust data that is collected and analyzed. That's really essential. Our approach incorporated both quantitative and qualitative research. We drew from primary sources, so company reports, our own investment impact assessments, as well as stakeholder interviews. So here you can see there's some testimonials thrown in there to kind of bring the case study to life. And then we use key metrics that we collected and analyzed. These include KPIs on healthcare impact. So we look at number of patients served, hospitals reached, and we try to highlight those in an illustrative way in the case study. We also look at economic impact indicators, so job creation, workforce composition, which you'll also see here. And then we also look at governance and sustainability metrics, so qualitative metrics, so things like certifications, environmental initiatives, safety records, things of that sort. So really kind of mixing quantitative and qualitative, I think, makes for a really compelling narrative and just kind of a more interesting story to tell rather than having just numbers or just descriptions. We did face some analytical challenges. Industry benchmarks are often difficult to obtain, which makes it harder to contextualize MNEs' achievements. Also, there are indirect effects such as patient cost savings and broader systemic improvements in healthcare, which prove challenging to quantify. So those are some of the limitations as well. But despite these limitations, I think this case study serves as an important contribution to understanding the dynamics of successful impact investments and tells a compelling stories of how in addressing some of the critical global challenges that we face. So yeah, I'll stop there and back to you, Matt.
Nora, thank you. Thank you so much for taking us through your decision-making process. And we're running a little bit over time, but I'd encourage those of you who can stay for another 5 minutes or so to do so, because in order to report, investors rely on the data provided to them by the invested companies or frontline nonprofits who are generating impact on the ground. So last but definitely not least, we really, really want to hear the perspective from one of those types of organizations. So I'd love to have 5 minutes or so to turn now to Sarah from TICO to learn more about their impact reporting journey, and particularly around how they think about collecting data and verifying data across multi-country, multi-intervention operations. So Sarah, over to you to take us home in the last 5 minutes, and for those who are able to stay, please do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone who joined this very informative webinar. And thank you for everyone who's going to stay right to the end so that I could tell you how a delivery organization such as TICO is able to report on impact. And just starting by saying that we're non-profit and we deliver services that are integrated for adolescents and young people in sub-Saharan Africa. So in line with what I have just had around the impact thesis, I'm going to just highlight it a little bit because it is going to center us on the next few slides that I'm going to be speaking to you about. So I could just give a popular version of it and say, if we provide integrated adolescent and youth-friendly services within the communities where adolescents and young people live, while leveraging on a technologically powered community and facility-based health system, we will increase information about SRH, HIV, sexual gender-based violence, and also increase access to these services, thereby leading to reduced teen pregnancies, reduced number of new HIV infections, and increased integrated support for adolescents who face sexual and gender-based violence. So some of the ways and some of the things that we think about when we are impact reporting, whether this is for development impact bonds or outcome-linked financing that we received or grants that we receive, is that, we have to think about what are we going to report about, what is important to the investor. And for us, impact is basically two things at the end of it all. We want to account for the number of users who have been impacted and the number of services that we have provided. And so on this slide, as a snapshot, besides just talking about how many users by country and what type of services they received, we also must link the health outcomes in terms of the outcome level and the outputs that we have received. And so begin to talk about things such as couple years of protection afforded if a young person takes on a contraceptive. Let's move to the next slide. And then just introducing the next slide by saying that at TICO, we are implementing the first ever development impact bond that's around adolescent sexual reproductive health that looks at delivery of HIV and contraceptive services. And on this impact bond, we are basically paid once we achieve these 5 metrics, and the payments are to be done quarterly. So when we think about the impact reporting related to the development impact bond, we must be able to report on these outcomes, and this unlocks payment on a quarterly basis. These outcomes also must be verifiable because the impact investors then layers on an external evaluator or verifier to be able to confirm this impact. So important for us when we are highlighting reporting for the impact bond is that we must report on the core payment metrics and indicate to what extent those have been achieved. Next slide. at TICO, as I said in my, what I was trying to highlight as our impact thesis is that we use a TICO application that helps us to get real-time data in terms of our implementation, both in terms of how we do demand generation, but also how we account for services that have been taken up and what type of services. We work in 7 countries, and so important for us to be able to provide real-time data, and all of our funders have access to real-time dashboards so they can actually monitor day by day, minute by minute what is happening. This helps us with transparency. This helps us with accountability, and also this helps us to step change implementation. With real-time data compared to retrospective data is that we can address and refine implementation as we go. Again, highlighting that our real-time dashboards provide for both aggregated data that helps us to compare country by country performance, potentially helping our impact investors to understand how big the operations are, which countries to invest in, if you had extra financing and things like that. But we are also able to drill down to the specifics around who are these users, where are they, month on month, what does this look like, and what type of services we are providing. Let's go to the next slide, and I'm trying to move really fast. An important aspect around impact reporting is that those results must be believable. And at TICO, using our real-time dashboard as well as layering on other ways of verifying data is so critical to us. And some of the ways that we are able to verify our impact is really through third parties, the users themselves, inbuilt authentication safeguards using the TICO application, and also AI where possible, especially where products are involved, product distribution, so that at the end of the day, we can verify that, a certain product was given to a particular user at a particular time. And so verifiability is important, and the next slide can really try to show us what kind of mechanisms we use. The first 2 around the data trend analysis and the enrollment trend analysis are really driven through technology. So through various technology applications, we are able to look at things such as spikes. We are able to account for the velocity of services and link that back to quality of implementation. We're also able to understand if the correct user is getting the correct service from whoever is the correct provider. And then we have human-driven verification mechanisms such as call centers, which we use to verify impact. There's on-site verification that actually humans go into the service delivery point to audit the registrations and to conduct random audits. You also have aspects such as monitoring the footfall, sitting in when service delivery is happening to be able to account for spikes, and as well as mystery client surveys, among other methodologies that we use for verification. And so our verification practice is really around being able to confirm to our impact investors that a real user and a real product was provided, which is extremely important when it comes to accountability. Now, on to my last slide that really talks about, we can talk about impact from a program implementer such as myself, or someone who is absolutely on top of our impact reporting and needs to report back. But it is so important that we understand what the user is saying. So we also collect data around what the girls are saying, whether this is through rating for those who have phones and able to rate the services that they receive. And the rating is usually between 1 to 5, 1 meaning I got a really poor service. I am unlikely to recommend this service provider to my friend. And once a girl scores between 1 and 3 on our services, they get a call from the call center if they consent to really find out what is going on with them. On the other hand, we also conduct regular monthly in Kenya client exit interviews to really understand the quality of the service delivery, the acceptability of that service, and thereby infuse the voice of the girl in terms of, step changing, what's working, what's not working for them, and really understanding where the user journey breaks for them. This also, when we hear the girl's voice, we are able to actually go back to the funders and say, this is what we hear the girl saying. Because at TICO, we are committed to take a girl-centric approach and really follow the girl in terms of trying to understand what services make sense to her, when, where, it also makes sense to her. So thank you very much for giving me those few minutes to really speak through how we are looking at and how we manage impact reporting at TICOM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Gwendolyn. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Henry. And of course, thank you, Matt. I think we can all agree we're still on. We have about 235 people still on. So that just shows that this topic is so rich and so wide, and the insights that have been provided by all those who presented. Our desire and our hope was to really show the applicability of these impact reporting tools, a deeper understanding of how these can correlate to your individual experiences in whether you're funding, whether you're receiving, whether you're a fund of funds. How do these all speak to you on these various levels? And as we move forward, I think the key takeaway has been, yes, data is important, but what are you tracking? If I could use Evelyn's point, keep it simple. But also don't forget that you're tracking for real people, which I think is where TICO comes in, and in some of the data that they've presented. So once again, thank you, everybody. I think there's a link in the chat if you're interested in more information about other sessions. Please do fill that in. And we'll also be offering a recording of this on email to you, as well as some resources from all of the presenters today. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and we look forward to hosting you again very soon.
Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and look forward to staying in touch.